Everyone. Happy Thursday. So today we'll be kicking off our final module in Unit 3, and we'll be discussing stakeholder presentations. Before we get started with that, wanted to check in and see if there were any questions on the assignment or module from yesterday. All right, awesome. Okay, so let's take a look. Let's take a look at stakeholder presentations. And the way that I have this structured for today is we'll talk about how we can present our work, not only in terms of focusing on all of the visual design principles that we've studied the last couple of weeks, but also being able to present our work when we are, depending on the audience that we're interacting with, and how to really set that stage so that way you are setting up the presentation in a way that your audience understands the context. And then towards the end of class, as part of our guided project, I am going to showcase an example project that I worked on in the past with my previous company. And I'll walk through how I would present the material and talk about the design decisions that I've made. All right, so if we think back to Unit 1, we actually had a design communication module which focused a lot on how to deliver an effective presentation. But now that we've had some time to practice with the design, let's talk about how we can present our design decisions through storytelling. According to UX Pins, the Visual Storyteller's Guide to Web UI Design, storytelling in web design guides the user experience, incorporating all types of media to craft a logical and emotional narrative out of thin air. Since the beginning of time, we've used storytelling to connect with one another. So think of campfires as you gathered around with different folks and told stories. And being able to tell a story well ties into making sure that you know your audience. Just like how we design experiences, understanding who our users are, we need to take the same approach when it comes to presenting our work. This allows us to create a narrative that resonates with our users. And as we go throughout the module, keep in mind that your presentation will be designed in the context of who will be viewing your work. The ability to present your work well will take a lot of practice. And in addition to today's lesson on storytelling, we'll discuss how to supplement your presentation using the power of visuals. So let's actually talk about visuals first. And a lot of these references that I'll pull are from this UX Pin ebook that is available in Training Kit for you to view. All right, so from a design perspective, when it comes to presentations, an image is worth more than 1,000 words. We've all heard this phrase, but it does have some truth behind it. Using imagery can be visually appealing and can be a powerful way to capture your user's attention and communicate your message. For example, there is this theory called the Pavio dual coding theory that states that we can recall images better because they both create a verbal and image code in our minds. When we create visual stories, we'll want to use images that can be easily remembered. That doesn't mean that we should never use text in a presentation, but by being able to add imagery, we help clarify our message and add additional context. For instance, here's an example of Headspace. So with Headspace, as we continue to scroll, this interface naturally encourages us to read the information, digest the illustrations that we see in front of us. This tour also walks a user through as to how their product will help someone live a healthier and more well-rested life. And if you didn't get a chance to capture that, as we get towards the bottom of the page, we're asked to sign up. And even if we chose not to sign up, these details are much easier to recall afterwards because it wasn't a website full of heavy text. Instead, Headspace told a clever story through its use of illustrations and short chunks of text. Questions on this page and how they're able to utilize this principle of storytelling. Okay, so then let's move on. So additionally, visual information is processed faster. And according to Jacob Nielsen, users often leave web pages in 10 to 20 seconds, but pages with a clear value proposition can hold people's attention for much longer. To gain several minutes of user attention, you must clearly communicate your value proposition within 10 seconds. Users have a limited attention span. If they're presented with heavy blocks of text, they may not read it. However, visual information can be processed up to 60,000 times faster than text information. And this holds true when you're presenting your work. Your presentation needs to be a visual storytelling tool. So if we look back at this Headspace example, the illustrations communicate the value proposition within seconds. We see a cartoon figure with headphones. Additionally, the added blocks of text create content. So on the top, in this example, we see this little figure. Then we continue to read that this is about a guide to health and happiness. And because visual content can create a variety of different emotions, we need to choose our visuals carefully and understand how it can be perceived by others. And a good practice is to understand your audience and consider what emotions you're trying to bring forth. Questions on the use of imagery and visuals? All right. So the next piece when it comes to designing your presentation are to take into consideration bullet points. Too often, we're guilty of using bullet points as a way to make content more visual, but bullet points aren't images. Just because you've broken a chunk of text into shorter lines and added a dot next to each doesn't mean you've magically transformed them into pictures. You haven't magically taken that text and made it an image. It's still words on a page, just with a little extra decoration. Now, bullet points are great to make your slides readable, but the way that we can also ensure that we are adding delight to our work is by adding additional imagery or rich visuals. The next point is that while visuals are important, the typography you choose will have just as much equal weight. This is going to set the overall tone of your presentation. Again, thinking in context of your users, how do you want them to perceive your slides? For example, if I were presenting my slides to a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, I may consider using a more traditional and professional typeface. Or if I'm presenting to my team of designers, I may use a sans serif that would portray it being more minimal in terms of design. From time to time, as we're putting together our slides to tell a story, a good practice is to zoom out. Continue to evaluate that your presentation fits within the context of your users' needs. And I'll show you an example of this as we get closer to our guided project. What questions do we have about visual storytelling?
Question. So some of the copy that would be on the websites, or if we're doing mobile applications, would be written by a writer and not necessarily us, or how my storytelling skills are not that great.
It will depend.
Okay.
So in my previous role, even at a really large corporate company, my second design role, I didn't have any copywriters, and it was my responsibility to write copy. And it's not easy to do. It's a constant iteration in itself. So if you are responsible, just keep writing, keep trying to make it more clear and concise. Copy is a whole separate workload that you may need to focus on if you don't have dedicated writers.
All right.
There are also a lot of voice and style guides out there. I think in the past I shared MailChimp, so that is also a great resource to refer back to if you just feel lost. And there is another book called Writing for Designers. I am trying to think of the name off the top of my head of who that author is. I will share that at the end of class, but that has also been a really great resource in terms of just being able to write clearly in your work. Great question. Other questions about visual storytelling? All right. So for the first half or for this particular section, we talked about how we can create presentations that are more aesthetically pleasing. And now let's switch gears and talk about how we can present our work in a professional and engaging manner. This is a quote from Jared Spool, and he quotes, "You could have the world's best design, but if you don't know how to explain the problem being addressed and the reason for your design decisions, the design will never get approved." And the key message with this is that context is key. For example, when it comes to presenting our final designs, we should not be presenting it without sharing any sort of background. This will leave people feeling confused, or worse, they'll ask you to explore other options as they may not be aware of all the work that you've put in. With any presentation, we need to focus on education. Presenting your work is a core skill for UX designers. So similar to the module we reviewed yesterday, where we're continuously collaborating with other designers, stakeholders, developers, we need to also get comfortable with presenting our work and articulating our design decisions. Oftentimes we visualize presentations taking place in a big corporate room with high-level executives, but the truth is we're always presenting. So like I mentioned earlier, it could be a super informal meeting that you're having with your manager, or maybe it is a really big meeting where you have to showcase all of your designs to a high-level executive. Being able to present well and effectively takes time and practice, and we'll go into some guidelines when it comes to presenting. Just to add more to this from my own experience, if you're uncomfortable with presenting, that is something that I hear a lot from folks in general, not just UX designers. And the way that you get better is that you just do it and you continue to practice and you continue to solicit feedback from other individuals. Some of you may be familiar with a group called Toastmasters. Happy to share that at the end of the module. But Toastmasters has organizations all around the world where you can join, where folks just practice speaking and provide feedback. And for those of you who may not have joined Toastmasters in the past, I will admit when I joined Toastmasters, I was really nervous. I was really scared that I was going to get judged for my presentation skills, but it was the most welcoming experience that I ever had at any club that I've joined. So if there is a Toastmasters near you, I encourage you to check that out if you feel like a presentation is a skill set that you should be working on. And I guess
I joined Toastmasters.
Awesome. That was going to be my next question. So how was that experience, JP?
It was good. Definitely a lot of public speaking and a lot of like um, presenting about like some of the stuff you've done. And they give you like topics on what's your next speech about. So it was really fun.
That's awesome. Anyone else has participated in Toastmasters or any other type of presentation group?
High school was absolutely filled with presentations. My God. It's like maybe 4 or 5 presentations per class per month. So I did a couple of them.
That's great. Yeah. I took my first presentation course in high school, and I had signed up for it for my second semester. And so all from my first semester, I was so nervous, but once I did it, I felt better. Very cool. Another way to get better is just to watch yourself. So you could speak, in front of your camera, record yourself and replay it back and see how you respond and see how you sound. So that's another good practice. Awesome. All right, so the way that we're going to structure our presentations is, first off, educating and setting context. So I keep talking about context. When you work as a UX designer, the first thing to understand is that you were hired to do the job because of your expertise. That means when you present your work, this isn't a time to make friends or to try to please someone. The goal of your presentation is to show how you were able to solve the main problems that you were tasked with. And a good practice is to put yourself in the user's shoe. Focus on how your persona will use the product so that you're reminding your audience that you're placing the user's interests top of mind. For example, if I were to design a food delivery service, as I would walk someone through my work, instead of just explaining how the design itself addresses the user's goals, I may begin the story talking about the persona that I've researched. Perhaps there's a persona named John who is constantly ordering food, and I tell that story with John's name instead of in the context of the user that I'm designing for. Also, whether you're reviewing the project for the first time or for the 100th time, don't forget to set context. This may be the 5th meeting of someone's day, and we want to make sure that we're making the most out of their time. Oftentimes, people gather for a meeting unsure what the purpose of it is, which frequently happens. We can set the information set the context by adding an agenda within the calendar invite. And if this is a continuation based on a previous meeting, remind everyone of the goals of the project and recap feedback at the start of the meeting. Questions on educating and setting context? For the second piece, involves guiding feedback, and this builds off of what we spoke about yesterday in terms of team collaboration. When we talked about team collaboration, we mentioned things like not asking open-ended questions. We wanted to make sure that we're using very specific questions towards the end of our presentation so that we're soliciting the right feedback. And this is the same thought process when it comes to presenting. We want to make sure that we're guiding our feedback. When we're presenting, it can become really easy for a meeting to take place without accomplishing any sort of goal. And let's face it, we can get distracted by one small thing, and now the meeting has diverted into a discussion that's far from what the original intent was. When you present your work, guide the discussion by explaining the goal of the project and what kind of feedback that you're looking to receive. Set those expectations with your stakeholders. For example, if you're presenting sketches, it's best to set the stage that you're currently ideating. If you're walking someone through a prototype, let them know that it's a working prototype and that not everything will be functional. So very similar to when you user test your designs, you might have heard in previous modules that you should set the expectation with the participant that it's not fully functioning, that they might run into a few bumps. And that's the same idea when it comes to presenting. There will be folks that you present to who may not understand what a prototype is. They may not understand why you have sketches, and providing that value and the reason why will help them understand. What questions do we have about guiding feedback?
Are we giving this context before the presentation, during the presentation, or after the presentation for guiding feedback?
I would recommend that you guide feedback at the start of the presentation. So once you've outlined what the goal of the project is, then you would go into stating what type of feedback you were looking for at the end of the presentation. So all of that gets set right up front.
Okay.
And you can also, at the end of the presentation, set that as a reminder just in case they forget, and close it with, this is the type of feedback that I'm looking for. What questions or comments do you have?
And we can apply this to our presentation to the developers tomorrow, correct?
Yes. Absolutely, absolutely. So one thing that comes to mind when it comes to guiding feedback, especially working with developers, is setting that expectation up front, asking them to, as they take a look at it, review things to see if it's technically feasible. That might be one way to guide feedback, to make sure that that is top of mind, versus having them review your work as if they were a designer themselves. They can most definitely share their thoughts and feedback, but just make sure that you're setting expectations up front.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Other questions about guiding feedback? Great. Okay, this is my next favorite piece that I like to address with everyone. And that means do not give a real estate tour. This phrase, I believe, was coined by Mike Montero, the design ethic advocate that we were discussing the other day. But he puts it nicely in one of his articles. So Mike Montero states, your job isn't to explain what's in front of them. He goes on to say, never explain what they can obviously see right in front of them. They can all see the logo on the top left. They can all see the search box. There's absolutely nothing more boring than a designer walking a client down the page, listing all the things that they can already see. And I love this a lot because I have seen early entry-level designers guilty of giving a real estate tour. I've even seen experienced designers also guilty of giving a real estate tour. So as you're walking through your work, make sure that you're talking about the project in terms of how it ties to the overall goals. Design decisions should be tied back to data, any user research that you've completed in the past, perhaps design theory principles that we've reviewed, maybe as far as human psychology principles that we've also reviewed. As part of your Build Week rubric, you will be asked to create a presentation. So these are things to think about as well. So that way we're planting the seeds in your head for that. Question on the real estate tour.
Yeah. I'm assuming that real estate tour is, and here is the bedroom, so here is the research, and here is this, and here's that. Is that correct?
It's more so along the lines of, if I were to showcase the homepage, I would say, well, here are the buttons on the bottom of the page. Here's an image that I've added in of a living room. Here's text that tells the user to sign up. And
Okay.
that's all in front of them.
Okay, so it's just pointing out the obvious and not really giving any context to what it is that you're presenting then.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. All right, for the next piece, it's all about being a human, speaking a human language. And depending on your audience, this is not a time to use fancy terminology. For instance, when we're in a room with other UX designers, perhaps talking about Gestalt principles or talking about serifs and sans serifs will make sense. But if I'm talking to a high-level executive and I start breaking out heuristic evaluations and not providing background information as to what that means, you may have someone who, one, will just be totally lost and confused, overwhelmed, not understanding the purpose of your presentation. Or two, you might actually embarrass that individual who thinks they should know what that terminology means and just assume that they do. And an example that this is also relevant to is if you ever are working as freelance designers, when you're working with clients, or perhaps maybe we've talked in the past, if you choose to work with a nonprofit, conduct some pro bono work, they chances are may not understand all of the terminology that we've learned so far at this UX, during this UX curriculum at Lambda School. So again, it's all about context and making sure that you are able to speak the same language as your audience. It's also ensuring that you continue to talk about how your project aligns with the stakeholders' business goals, and less about how you put together a color palette using a color model as an example. What questions do we have about speaking human?
I guess I have a question about that. So understanding your audience, yes, is very important. However, if you put in a couple of terminology that we use within UX design, would that not translate to the person understanding their material and knowing their material and being an expert in the field? Or is it just not a good idea at all?
It depends who you're speaking to. If, for instance, let's say you meet with your developers tomorrow and they don't quite understand why you've chosen a particular typeface, that's when you may start breaking into those pieces of terminology, but doing it in a way where you make it understandable and not phrasing it where you say, well, we learned about serifs, and serifs are easy to read, or sans serifs are easy to read, and they have large X heights. But if you could do it in a way where it's more understandable to that person, and you could say, well, based on some of the design theory principles that we've learned about typography, we find that typefaces that are a little bit larger does make it more readable for users, and that might be a way around it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Mostly in terms of like stakeholders, who don't have any context behind the details and the terminology used. I was just wondering how it would go in a presentation, because I do know when stakeholders or CEOs or product managers do their presentations, I've had a lot of instances where they'll throw out some business terminology and then I'm like, okay, let me write that down and see what's happening there. But at the same time, it did give me the impression that they knew what they were talking about. Mm-hmm. And even though I needed to do a little bit of research, I felt a little bit better knowing that they knew what they were talking about. Mm-hmm. So I was just trying to see, of course there's balance, but I was trying to see how much is too much, and if I don't have a specific expertise in the language that we use, and maybe I'll be perceived as a noob.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. That happened frequently at the corporate company that I've worked with. And when I first started, they were using a lot of acronyms, a lot of business terminology that I didn't understand. But that was a result of just the culture of the company, where over time that was ingrained because we would have a large webcast where they would also use the same terminology. So what I would recommend is, if you are, I would still stay away from using jargon, but if you do need to use it because you want to sound like you know what you're doing, always provide an explanation and always help them understand what it means, instead of just saying, well, based on the Gestalt principles, this is why we did X, Y, and Z.
Okay, yeah. All right, thank you.
Sure. Other questions on this? I have seen where this has backfired in terms of a hiring interview, where I was interviewing a candidate who all she did was use fancy UX jargon and explain to me what user experience was and talked about all of these principles. And thinking back on it, to be honest, it wasn't a good experience for me, because I felt like she was trying to educate me even though I was in the same industry as her. So again, all in context of your audience. Okay. All right, so this next piece is not getting defensive, and this also builds off of what we discussed yesterday during team collaboration. The feedback that you get for your work, do not take it personally. As you begin to get more critiques, take the time to listen to what your stakeholders say. It's always okay to say that you'll think about their feedback and return back with an answer. You should never feel like you have to give an answer on the spot. You should never feel like just because somebody tells you to change a particular color or typeface that you should do it automatically. Always ask why, always listen, and always say that you'll think about their answer or their feedback if you don't have an answer for them. Additionally, avoid having a defensive tone when you answer questions. As we discussed yesterday, being respectful and listening to others is a core skill set when it comes to teamwork. If a question or piece of feedback is unclear, ask that person to rephrase it. And remember that everyone that you work with is ultimately sharing the same goal as you and wanting to create a great experience for its users. Questions on not getting defensive. Okay. And then the final guideline that we have is just being confident. Being confident is going to stem from just practicing a lot. And some of the things that I like to do when it comes to presenting is standing. Standing helps project my voice, or at least I think it does. And also, depending on who your audience is, just making sure that you're dressed in context of your user. So if you are presenting to a high-level executive, perhaps maybe, especially at a super corporate-y environment, that you may want to dress up. Whereas if you're having a casual conversation with your product manager, you don't necessarily need to worry about it. But being confident stems from practicing a lot. What questions do we have on this? Okay. All right, so we're right at 12:37. I'm sorry, I'm on Eastern time. All right, let's continue to work through. The next thing I want to showcase is a presentation that I've worked on. And It's a little bit lengthy. I've actually shortened it down a bit. But the purpose of this demonstration is to give you an example of how I would present to an individual that is not a UX designer. So think in context of somebody that is a CEO or vice president, high-level executive. And the goal of this presentation is to walk them through in terms of how I was able to help redesign an existing experience that was really challenging for users to go through. Everything that you see here is based off of Verizon Style Guide. So I ask that, it will ultimately be up to you to craft a presentation that is going to fit within your tone and style. What you see here, the topography is pulled from Verizon's Style Guide. The colors, as we get closer to talk about the color palette, the topography, all of the patterns and components. To level set, this came from Verizon and this was built by a different team. But what I'll illustrate is how I would articulate the design decisions that I've made, assuming that I was the individual that had put together the style guide. So I'll walk through what that looks like. And then we'll also take a look at how I present my low fidelity and high fidelity design. Questions before I get started with the demo?
Are we presenting, who's your audience?
So my audience is going to be, think of an executive who is in charge of my entire organization. So that individual will be in charge of the design teams, all the operation teams, marketing teams, and they may not necessarily come from a background where they understand UX design. So this will also be about educating that individual. All right. So I don't have a script prepared. So in this case, we'll go through it. All right. So again, yeah, thinking that I'm presenting to you in context of a person that's a high-level executive. And what you'll notice is the tone is going to be a little bit more professional. You'll also find that what I present may not be the same voice and style that you'll present with your developers. Your developers that you're meeting with tomorrow is not a time to have this stuffy conversation. It should feel very informal. So that way you are really setting the tone for the relationships that you'll have with them. Okay, cool. And the way this is set up, I have all of my slides in Figma. They have been prototyped. So if I click on share, we can begin, or the play button, we can begin. All right. Awesome. All right, cool. So that being said, hi, I'm Melissa Kark. I am one of the UX designers on the Verizon Fios team. And for the last 4 months, I have been working closely with other designers and developers to redesign an existing Verizon experience. To provide some context, this redesign is based off of an existing process we have in place where we currently help customers set up their broadband services. Specifically, helping customers set up things like their router, their TV boxes, making sure that their internet is set up. And the goal of this presentation is to walk through the thought process that went behind this redesign. What I'll be looking for in terms of feedback at the end of this presentation are your thoughts as to whether the product itself has truly met the objectives of our business. I know that as a company, we have been really focused on making sure that we reduce call-in volumes and that we are focusing heavily on making sure that we have our customers rely on our digital experiences. So the first part to this is helping you all understand how this project came about. This imagery that you see here is an example of what our old experience looked like. And as you can see, it's very archaic. A lot of the styling and branding is not up to date with the existing style guide that we have. And the problem that we've also encountered is that based on usability testing, customers did not understand how to navigate through this experience. For example, if when users landed on a specific page, they would be confused as to which item they would need to select. Would it be the set-top box? Would it be the cable card? And then they also had difficulty in understanding the instructions that resided below. As a result, in order to make sure that we created a better experience for our users, we started at ground zero and started thinking about how other competitors do this process well. So not direct competitors like Comcast, for instance, but other competitors that focused on making sure that customers who were to set up their equipment, it made it very easy to do. For instance, a couple of examples that we see here. In the middle, this is a screenshot from Eero. And so as you can see in comparison to the previous screenshot, Eero does a really nice job in focusing the user's attention to complete one step at a time, whereas in our older experience, users felt very overwhelmed with what action they needed to take. We have also evaluated that through other competitors that we've tested, that we've found that having this hand-holding experience has really resonated with the user. So in order to begin this process, what we started to do was think about and reimagine how this new setup experience could look like. And for a few days, we collaborated as a team to sketch out ideas. Now, just to level set, these sketches that you see in front of you is not the final product itself, but just really brainstorming and how we can reinvent this experience and make it better for our users. The next step is understanding the overall architecture of the self-installation flow. It wasn't as easy as taking what existed and redesigning it by updating it with the existing style guide that we had in place, but it was also thinking of it from an architecture standpoint, meaning we had to understand what it took from a user's perspective when it came to setting up their router, or what it came to when it came to setting up their network extender. And this is just a small snapshot of what we've worked on. And by evaluating what the existing experience was, we went back in and modified it so that way we could reduce less friction within the experience itself. At a high level, in terms of the user flow, we significantly reduced a number of steps. We made it easier for the user to recover from their errors. And we'll see this in the upcoming prototype as we get closer to the end of this presentation. Part of redesigning this also involved creating multiple variations and taking the time to test it with existing participants. For example, on the right-hand side, you can see very, very low fidelity wireframes. These are basically, again, similar to sketches where we thought about how we could re-envision this process. And through multiple rounds of testing, we identified that through these early stages of this prototype, that there were a few things that we could do better. For example, labeling and copy was not very clear to users. For instance, as we get to the welcome page and we start scrolling through what types of equipment that has been shipped to the user, they were unclear as to the purpose. For example, we ship a ton of cables to customers, and customers are unaware of what the difference is between a blue cable and a red cable. So making sure that we identified labels in our designs will truly help them understand what the purpose of their accessory or tool is. The second piece that we've identified is that customers have a fear when it comes to setting up their equipment. If they haven't done it in the past, they will state that they might feel a little bit overwhelmed. And we also saw that the copy we were using did not really help those customers feel comfortable. So as part of this feedback, we've also gone in and modified the language to make the user feel at ease. And this also ties into making sure that we have a human voice behind it. Okay. As a result, based on usability testing, we finalized our low fidelity wireframes. Again, meaning that we have just a simple black and white prototype that we were working with that we used to test our users. And once we felt comfortable with this experience, then we continue to move on and think about what the overall experience could look like in the hands of the user. All right, so I'm just going to stop here. These next few slides, these, again, as a reminder, I did not come up with the color palette or the typefaces, as that was driven by the company and a separate team. But I will, for this particular presentation, I will pretend that I did, just to help you, help all of us understand how to defend our design decisions, or at least talk about why we've made certain color choices or typefaces. All right. Okay, so moving on, before we actually converted all of our low fidelity wireframes into these higher fidelity wireframes with colors, we took a step back and started thinking about how we could work on our style guide to make this experience overall better. And the first step we did was take a look at color. Originally, a lot of the color schemes that we were using wasn't very accessible, meaning that it was really difficult for readers to be able to read and see their content. As a result, we reevaluated the color scheme and selected colors that fit within Verizon's messaging and brand. We also focused on a color palette that had really represented a true version of its color. The next thing that we did was we focused on the typography. And after exploring a variety of typefaces, we ended up choosing this typeface called New Grotesque, because we felt that it was very easy to read in comparison to the other fonts that we've used in the past. And then I'll stop here. In the event that this is somebody who is actually a designer and I'm reviewing a style guide, I would add more context. So we focused on finding a typeface that had a relatively high X height, which filled the space comfortably and did not diminish the legibility of the text. And the type scale that we use is actually based off of this classic typographic scale. We use this because we felt that it created a more harmonious and balanced set of font sizes as we were putting together our mock-ups. And the typographic scale that we use follows a ratio, which makes the design feel more cohesive. As we continue on, we also focused on creating buttons and components. And the goal was to create a modular system that was flexible across different platforms. We evaluated each component to ensure that it met existing conventions and were clear to users who interacted with it during user testing. Finally, this is the actual design that was shared with the developers that incorporated all of the feedback, and as well as the color or style guide that we just reviewed. And as you can see, in comparison to the original design, we really focused on making sure that we were hand-holding the customer, that they focused on one step on a time so that they were not overwhelmed on what additional actions they would need to take. In this particular example, we're walking through the customer step by step. So they've already set up their router. At this point, they're ready to set up their TV box. And based on the work that we've done with the developers, they've also incorporated additional use cases where we're automatically able to auto-detect whether or not that device has successfully been connected to our network. Okay. And then that being said, just to conclude this presentation, again, the primary purpose of this redesign was to not only update the look and feel, but we are looking for feedback to understand that this experience would ultimately help reduce call-in volume from our customers. And then that would be it. What questions do we have about the presentation? Any particular slides that I can review? No questions? You all feeling solid for tomorrow? Yeah. So just to level set, this entire voice and tone is going to be different than what you have tomorrow. The way that this presentation was set up is, as you can see, there's a lot less text because I am going to be having that conversation with the stakeholders. These are not slides that would be sent out in an email for those to interpret, in case you're wondering why there is just imagery that's focused on here. And as I talked more about the color and topography and buttons and components, this is something that you will also need to put together as part of your Build Week project. We will be asking you to defend your design decisions, help us understand the colors that you've chosen, the type, the topography, your components, because at the end of Build Week, we're not going to be able to sit down with you and have everyone review their work and present it. That needs to show through the presentation that you put together. All right. Any questions on this? Cool. All right. If you don't, that's fine. If you think of something, let me know. Let's do this. Let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll talk more about Build Week. All right, welcome back, everyone. I was just checking Slido and someone added, I just looked up and saw 2 other people dancing in reference to prior to our module. So that's awesome. Hopefully I'm playing music that you all enjoy. And if you have any feedback or would like to listen to something else, I am open to that. Great. Okay, any questions on the module before we move on to discussing about Build Week? Any fears in terms of presentations that I can help address? Okay. All right. Let's actually take a look at the assignment and then we'll go into Build Week. So your assignment is available in Training Kit. If we go into our module, into project, for this afternoon, you will continue to work on your Build Week project. And for context, UX designers will often put together presentations to showcase their work. For the first part of the assignment, create a stakeholder presentation for your development team. Think in context of your audience. What are some of the things that they'll want to understand? And for the second half of your assignment, continue to make updates to your Build Week project. As a stretch goal for today, if you have already worked on your presentation or you've finished it, you can go ahead and create a stakeholder presentation for next week. And your audience is going to be the UX instructor and UX labs manager. And to be more specific, that is myself and Elizabeth Lynn. Begin to draft what this presentation would look like in the context of who you'll be presenting to or who you'll be creating this presentation for. For example, how did you develop your color palette? Why did you choose specific colors? How did you design your type system? How has your design progressed through iterations? For your submission, include a link to your stakeholder presentation that you've created for your development team and a link that showcases the latest updates that you've made to your Build Week project. For this particular assignment related to the presentation, here are the objectives for the rubric. And these are pieces that we've touched on earlier. So the first, to meet a level 2 in terms of imagery. Presentation makes good use of appropriate imagery. Imagery is used within context. For one, presentation lacks imagery or imagery is used improperly. For example, imagery does not contribute to its overall storytelling. We'll also be looking at typeface. So choice of typeface fits within the context of its audience. And I have an example here. So professional typefaces may be used for something where you're presenting to an executive at a corporate company, whereas minimal typefaces may be used in more casual settings, and making sure that type is legible and makes it easy for the user to read. Now, on the flip side, for level 1, presentation is text heavy. There's improper use of type. Line width is greater than 66 characters. Eyes move around a lot when looking at the presentation, and there is a lack of text hierarchy. And then we always need to consider the language, so making sure that the language that we're using for content is simple and clear to understand, and that we're not using jargon that's unrecognizable. And so we've listed the examples that I shared earlier: Gestalt, heuristic evaluation, etc. As far as your presentation, it describes the solution and includes clear descriptions of the design decisions. All design descriptions are based off of user feedback, data, or design theory principles, and that there are no spelling or grammatical errors. For level 1, presentation fails to describe the solution or doesn't meet the audience. And there's no slide deck, or reasoning is purely subjective. For example, I chose this color because I liked it. and then the submission format is going to remain the same as it's been. Questions on the assignment or rubric?
So for both presentations, it's just us working on it. So it's like a solo project. Do we say I, or should we just always talk as a we when referring to stuff?
As you're presenting out loud?
Yes. Instead of saying I did this or I did that, should we say we, but there's only one of me?
You can say I. That's
Should
fine.
say I? Okay.
Yeah.
It sounds really strange. It's
It
like,
does.
Yeah.
But you can just set that expectation up front and say, I worked on this, everything that you're seeing, and that's okay. That's okay to say, like, I put together the user flows, these are what the journey maps look like, or this is what the color palette. That's fine.
right, thank you.
Wouldn't saying I too much kind of give you an egocentrical point of view sometimes?
It could. So I'm not encouraging where you keep saying, I did this, I did that. But you could phrase it in a way where the next part of this process was focusing on the typography system. Like there's ways around it where you don't feel like you have to repeat yourself. There's ways to structure your sentences so that it doesn't make you sound egotistical in the words of Ivan.
So I had a quick question, Melissa, about the assignment.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a little unsure about what this presentation is meant to be about, because I'm just working on a prototype that I'm just going to walk them through and maybe share my screen. It's not necessarily a slides presentation or anything. So what is it that you actually expect here? Like I'm not so sure what the expectation of this presentation would be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I would say that other things that you should be showcasing to your developer are the user flows and the style guide. And you may have it set up where you just walk them through a prototype. Yeah. And that's okay. But I would still like to have the other information organized where you can just take that screenshot and paste it into a presentation to walk them through it. Does that answer your question?
No, not really. I mean, I'm not so sure why is it, I'm happy to do that, but I'm not so sure how that would be really helpful if I'm going to go ahead and share my prototype where I would show them, oh, this is where the user flows are and everything.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure why do I need to take separate, like, screenshots and put them in the slides before. Is that how you would do it? Like, to sort of show them screenshots and then sort of take them through the prototype?
Yeah, so you bring up a good point. Part of this assignment is to also work on how to put together a presentation. And so the way that I've set it up is I'm trying to make it more relatable to Build Week, so that way you're also not duplicating work. Now, in the real world, when you're short on time, showing a prototype and screen sharing or user flow is totally fine. But I want you to all get an opportunity to practice putting together what a visually designed presentation looks like to help prepare you for next week as you start working on what that will be when myself and Elizabeth receives your work. Does that help provide clarity?
And yes, it does. And when is it that we would be presenting to you and Elizabeth? Is that going to be Friday next week?
Currently there are no plans to have you present to us individually. So actually that is a good segue into Build Week. So let me just hold on that and I'll elaborate more, but let me see if there's any other questions related to the assignment or rubric. Okay, all right. So for next week, let me walk you through the schedule and we'll talk about the day over day. Let's get my calendar. Okay. All right, so I am, as a reminder, in Eastern time, in case these dates or these times look different, so please refer to the Pacific time. And what we're looking at is, so tomorrow we'll have our kickoff after sprint Q&A. And then next week, we will not be meeting in terms of reviewing modules. You will be meeting with your teams. But what I will have set up is from 12 to 1. If you would like to join for Q&A, stop in to ask questions. Anything that's on your mind, any help that you need, I will be available. So we'll have the Q&A, hourly Q&A each day. And then what I'll also do is open up my calendar, so that way if you'd like individual feedback, you can set up time with me. And I'll share that as we get closer to the week. And then as far as when your work will be due, your work will be due on Thursday. So you'll have your sprint retro where you'll submit everything that you've worked on. And then just due to the nature of the schedule, to my knowledge, there are no presentations that you'll have to conduct with myself and Elizabeth. We will just be looking at the work that you put in your Figma file, as well as the presentation that you've designed. Does that answer your question, Nabia?
Yes, it does. So for the build week, you just want us to share a link to the presentation. That's all. With the talking points, because there's a lot of it's sort of just one image and then there's a lot of talking. So do you want us to write down all of the procedure and what our thought process?
So they're available in Google Doc, or not Google Doc, Google Slides or Keynotes. There is a way to add additional notes. So if you'd like to provide more clarity there, you can do that. Don't feel like you have to write a huge summary. We're just trying to understand the thought process behind the designs that you've put together.
Would it be better just because writing can be difficult sometimes, just to make like a small, like a quick little video, like 5-6 minutes, and send you the link to that instead?
You can if you'd like. Let me check in. Let me check in with the team. Let me get back to you on that. I think that should be fine, as long as we have at least access to your slides. And if you'd like to supplement it with a video, you do not need to, but you can.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So there was a question. So this was also Nabia's question. Oh, sorry. Was there a question?
It's okay. It's okay. Go ahead. I'll talk later.
Okay. Let me walk through the rubric and the day over day, because I think that might answer your questions, and then I'll take additional questions for anything else that's on your mind. All right. So the first thing is not this. There's 2 resources that I will share with you. The rubric may have already been shared with you, but if not, I'll post it in the Slack channel. But there was a question yesterday, what do I do during my downtime if I'm not working with the developers? And to level set, what you will be submitting next week and what we will be grading you on is not only just teamwork and collaboration, but the output of your designs. So we are not going to be evaluating what the developers put together, because they will be graded on that. But what we care about is making sure that your mock-ups, all of the work that you've done for your Build Week project, aligns with all of the design theory principles, visual hierarchy principles that we've talked about. So when you have downtime, feel free to, or not feel free, but you should continue to iterate on your designs. If for some reason, and I gave this an example to the TLs, if for some reason you decide midweek or you decide on Monday that you would like to change your color palette because it's not aligning with the Build Week rubric, go for it. Just don't confuse your developers. They will continue to work off of what you share with them tomorrow. But as far as what you're submitting, you are free to create iterations of it. You are free to update color palettes, components. So don't feel like you're pigeonholed to what you've been working on. So if you will have time to make things better if you feel like there's a need. That being said, I have put together a day-over-day milestone. There might be some additional tweaks. I'm just having the labs team review this, but happy to share this with you all. And this will set a day-over-day as to what to expect. So on Friday, you'll meet with your team after Q&A. You'll complete this icebreaker activity. If there's a Trello board, you will also be joining that. And then that's when you will go in and present your prototype, your style guide, Figma, your presentation. And then there's also a copy of a linked canvas, a product canvas that you'll work together as a team to fill out, which looks like this. And this just talks about what the product vision is, what is the problem that your product is solving, what are the features. And there will be teams that don't have a UX designer. So what you see here under design and planning, build week planning and design worksheet, this is extra information for those who don't have a designer on their team, but I would encourage you all to take a look at it. So if you click in, you'll learn how to build a beautiful application. This talks about what those students who don't have designers, how they need to get set up for success. And this is the process that they would normally go through. They would have this kickoff meeting. They would spend time on the weekends to actually figure out what their design system or style guide is going to look like, depending on their preferences. If folks are busy, then that gets moved over to Monday. There's also a visual design basics lecture held by Elizabeth. So if you're interested in viewing that, definitely recommend for you to view it. And then this also instructs how to create a design system, how to find color palettes. This is not something that you have to do because we've already done it, but this is just good information to see what we're giving to developers without a UX designer. And there may be additional information that you find out that you can incorporate as part of your work. So that's for Friday. And then throughout the week, you'll have a schedule that is also outlined in your Google Calendar, but I've also added pieces here. On Monday, you'll continue with your career lessons. We'll talk more about the Build Sprint rubric, but just making sure that each day you're reviewing that, making sure that you wrap up the product canvas. So the product canvas was the link that we were just reviewing that you had worked with on the team, and ensuring that you update Trello. And for your afternoon block, most of you should already have this done. This is all the work that you need to have passed over to your developers. So this could change, this could differ person to person. And I've also added in stretch goals. So if you'd like to plan for usability testing, you can do so. And then what will take place is that instructor Q&A at 12 p.m. For downtime, I listed a Q&A. So what should I be doing during my downtime? Once your developers have a strong grasp of your product, you will have downtime to continue making iterations and improvements to your build week project. Even though there may not be enough time for developers to build out all of these features, remember that the UX instructor and UX Labs team will be evaluating your final presentation and mockups. And these are some suggestions. First, improving upon your visual design. So continuing to assess and iterate on it. And I've also included the design basics video that you can take a look at. Creating iterations, that is a piece that we're looking for as part of your rubric. Again, we'll review it soon. But frequently in a UX design role, you may have as many as 20 different screens. And the presentation that I was showcasing earlier, this is just a snippet of what I've worked on. I can't even count, maybe over 50, 100, I don't even know. This is just a snippet of the number of iterations that I created for this particular project. So iterations is what we are looking for, at minimum 5. Where did that go? Okay, and then working on your presentation. Oh, sorry. So with creating iterations during design exercises, we'll frequently iterate on as much as 20 different screens based on one mockup. Come up with 15 plus variations of your work. Remember, you're required to show at least 5 iterations with explanations in your presentation. And then you can also work on your presentation. The ability to articulate and present our work is a critical skill set for UX designers. Your presentation should describe your final solution and include a clear description of your visual design decisions. Pay attention to detail. There should be no spelling or grammatical errors. All right, so let me go through this and then I'll take questions on day over day. And then Tuesday, again, mostly the same information. I think the only thing I took out was that you don't have your careers. You're just meeting with your team if necessary, and you'll just continue working on the things that are listed here. And again, this is the time to really push yourself and go above and beyond. Same thing for Wednesday. This hasn't changed. But then on Thursday, that is when there will be a code freeze. So in terms of the developers' perspectives, they will not be able to go in and add any additional features. For you, because you will be submitting the sprint retro at the end of the day, just making sure, again, that you're taking a final look at this build sprint rubric, that you are, if your developer needs help in just understanding and making sure that what they've built matches your mockups, just assisting with that. Continuing to work on everything, continuing to make sure that you're all wrapped up for the day. And then on Friday, that's when you'll have your demo day. So in the Slack channel, Ryan or someone from his team will create a sign-up sheet for those of you that are interested in showcasing your work, and there will be a school-wide demo that will take place. Questions on the day over day?
I had a question for Monday.
Yes.
There, at the very bottom, there was something pertaining to 15 iterations or variations of your work. Mm-hmm. Can you elaborate? Is that on what we existingly have?
So you can use, yes, so I can elaborate on that. For what you're submitting, we're only looking for 5, and that should match up with the previous work that you've already done, where you were iterating based on the human psychology principles that we've reviewed. We were iterating on the visual hierarchy, so you can include that. But what I would encourage you all to do, and this really should say, thank you for catching that, that really should say iterations. So if you have the time, continue to iterate. Don't think about it too much. Just iterating just means changing little things and creating several screens. It could be adjusting the text hierarchy. It could be making a header bold. It could be removing an image or placing a button somewhere else. And that's the whole goal of iterating. You're thinking fast and you're just producing. So that way at the end of it, when you look at everything, you could say, hey, well, this particular design I think fits really well in terms of what we're trying to solve for, and let's move forward with it.
Do you want us to document these 15 plus iterations?
That would be awesome. Yes,
okay.
Always document, always save them.
Okay. Is it 15 different like pages, so to speak, or you want like 15 different iterations of the whole wireframe? Or because I've had like every page I might have like a couple of different layouts that I was testing, and then I put them on the side. So does this count as 2?
So iterations can be based on one screen. That's okay. So if you have several for one screen, you could use that. As long as you're experimenting, add that in. Does that help answer your question, Nora? All right, other questions about the day over day?
I have questions about iterations.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes for the smaller menus or tooltips, them, you definitely go over several things where you try out like certain text, and then you finalize something because it's such a small little thing, and what you come up with, you're pretty satisfied with it. But that doesn't mean that you didn't think about or played with different fonts or colors and those are iterations that sort of happen in your head. I'm trying to say is sometimes iterations are kind of hard to capture just because you've just sort of thought about them, you know.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So what I would recommend is, as you're thinking through these things, capture them either in sketches or capture them in your software. It's the best way. It's always there's going to be a really big difference between what you visualize in your mind versus what you actually see in front of you. And that is a best practice that I've used. Yes, there's a lot of thought that goes into putting together an interface, but it's a lot easier to put it together and see it visually. And that also serves as a source for you to showcase it to other folks and get their feedback. So I hear you, Nabia, I totally get it. But I recommend that the more that you can put it in software, the better, so that you can see a progress of your work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I do. I think it makes sense. It's just that it's a little bit more sort of time consuming at times, just to sort of save every thought you had. Anyways, I'll try and do that more. Thank you.
Yeah, try it. And I'll give you, let's just go through an example. And I'll show you what I mean by iteration. Like, I'll show you my process. This is, if we think back to like one of the earlier guided projects. Okay, so we had this flutter, right? And let's say if I were to take a look at this particular screen, let's say I am in the early stages, I'm not so worried about color itself. Let me actually detach all of these so that it's easier. But this is my first iteration. My second iteration could be, well, what could this look like if we were to bold this? What could these individual names look like if I were to create them to be all uppercase? All right. What if I made another iteration where, okay, well, I don't really like how these are all capitalized. It feels like it's yelling at me. So, whoa, what is that? What if I left that alone? What if I made this a little bit bigger? Would that draw more attention? That seems a little big. Maybe I won't go with that. What could it look like if, instead of having first name and last name separated out, that this whole thing just became first name, so as I go throughout these, this is how I would portray iterations. This is an example, and it could just be tiny changes that you're making across a particular screen, a particular user flow. Even it could come down to copy. And so this is just a good way to get all of your thoughts out. This is especially helpful when it comes into the wireframing stage. So less when you already have a high fidelity design, but when you're just truly exploring. Maybe I will go ahead and play with the fill and see what that looks like. And so this is just one snapshot of that. Nabia, does that help you understand more so like my thought process around it?
Yes, it does. It does. It's just that I guess I have like bad habits where if I was working on this, I would just continue making changes to the same until I feel like, oh, this is good enough. But I've never really, because there's so many different components that go into. I'm not so sure how to. It would be just a lot of I don't know, a lot of work to, you know, to keep a copy of every thought that you've had when you're designing like different parts of a website. But yeah, I see how you're doing it. I just need to, I guess, get into the habit of doing it that way.
It's always easier in the beginning.
Yeah.
And yes, it's and for me, it's really easy to make updates to one screen and to continue to work on it. But the more that you can make duplicates and then afterwards, like step away and come back to it, then you'll have a fresher pair of eyes. I'm really guilty of just like staring at something for a really long time. This happened to me the other day. I was working on a portfolio piece, and I was like, "Oh, this is killer! Like I've got the typography, I've got the spacing." And then the next morning, I look at it, and I'm like, "What did I create? This is not what I intended it to be." So for me, you know, I hope that I could share that that has been helpful, just to not feel so caught up in a screen. Cool.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, totally. Other questions on iterating? Okay. All right, so let's take a look at the rubric. And with this rubric, there are two categories that we'll be looking for. One is going to be focused on all of the design principles that we've touched on in the previous weeks. And then the second piece is going to be your teamwork assessment. With that being said, just remember that you need a 2 or greater to pass. And the first objective is visual clarity, contrast, and hierarchy. To meet a level 2, making sure that the most important elements of the design stand out. For example, CT8, call to actions and headings. Contrast is refined and not overdone. For example, if a button already stands out, no need to add a drop shadow. Uses a type and color system. Does not have any unused type or color styles. Type is legible. Line width is under 80 characters. It's easy for the user to read the page. Color is only used when it adds value by providing visual emphasis, adding clarity, signaling clickability, and that there's one clear primary color. All actions are the same color. For level 1, we'll take a look at that as well. That is going to represent no clear hierarchy of elements on a page. The eye is drawn to multiple conflicting spots on a single page. So thinking back to our lesson around saccades, how if it's really hard to direct your attention to one piece, chances are you probably need to go ahead and adjust that so that the user can remain focused. Use of more than 2 font families. No set type system, font sizes and weights are all arbitrary. Colors clash or weaken the visual hierarchy of the page. Can identify the primary color, and there's more than 5 shades of gray. Questions on visual clarity, contrast, and hierarchy before I move on to the next category? Okay. We'll also have time tomorrow to review any additional questions if none come to mind. The next piece is visual spacing and alignment that we always talk about. So level 2, elements that are related to each other are grouped closer together. Elements that are not related are spaced further apart. Elements are aligned to each other, but the system is not cohesive across pages. Level 1, no defined margins. Eyes move around a lot when looking at design, and proper use of Z-scan. So that is a principle or a guideline that we talked about early in the human psychology principle. And so what we mean by improper use of Z-scan is you literally have a page set up where you have components or elements that are laid out in a diagonal, and again, is really not making it clear in terms of where the user needs to follow in terms of the way that the design is laid out. Aligned elements are off by 1 or more pixels. Questions on visual spacing and alignment?
I have a quick question. My stuff is not currently pixel perfect. is this something I'm supposed to get done now before Friday, or is it something I'm working on next week to make sure everything aligns and everything's good?
Yeah, you will have all next week up until Thursday to prior to submitting your sprint retro. So you can work at that. Yeah, definitely. Right. We should try to strive to make it as aligned and pixel perfect as we can for the developers, but you'll be collaborating with them and talking to them. So just set that expectation. And as you continue to clean up your work, if you could just update it and just let them know so that they have something to reference to. But you will also have next week up until Thursday to fix things that you're noticing in this grid as we review it. Okay. All right, so the next section, design patterns and aesthetics. So meeting level 2, UI elements that repeat across the experience are consistent. Type styles and color usage are consistent. Every fill style and type style is saved, could change primary color of entire design file with one change. Every text instant uses a type style. Every shape and text instant uses a fill style. There are no spelling or grammatical errors. And then for level 1, deviates from common design patterns. If common design patterns not used, okay, so deviates from common design patterns. So what we mean by that is just using unconventional design patterns. For instance, if you are creating something from scratch and it's not an existing convention, if we were to test that, let's say through usertesting.com or through usability test, would it pass? So always keep that in mind as you're creating your components. No consistent design language across the entire experience. Use of default, so this represents black, use of default black, drop shadows over a 30% opacity, and use of Arial. Questions on design patterns and aesthetics? All right. And then the last piece to this category, reasoning and presentation. Students' presentation describes their solutions and includes clear descriptions of all the visual design decisions that they made. How did they develop their color palette? How did they design their type system? All design decisions are based off of user feedback, data, or design theory. Presentation showcases at least 5 iterations over the course of Unit 3 with explanations, and there's no spelling or grammatical errors. For level 1, students' presentation fails to describe their solution. Reasoning is purely subjective. For example, I chose this color because I liked it and or there was no slide deck. Questions on reasoning and presentation?
I have one last question, sorry.
You can ask as many questions as you need to. This is for me to help you all out.
You showed your presentation in Figma. Mm-hmm. We're used to doing it, and well, I'm used to doing it like as slides on Google Slides. What do you think would work best for, say, this Friday? Should we have everything on Figma and then do a prototype?
Do what's going to be easiest for you for tomorrow's presentation. So if it's easier to create slides in Figma because you have everything in there, use that. If it's easier to create slides in Google Slides because that's just what you're familiar with, use that. So it's all about working smart and not hard. And so use a tool that is going to work best for you. There is more flexibility in Figma, and you do all have experience with it. So I would say that would be the biggest difference between Google Slides and using Figma for presentations, if you really want to try to get like nitty gritty with like more of the visual design aspect.
Thank you.
Sure. All right, other questions on this piece? Okay, and then the second category is teamwork assessment. So MVP, students' work demonstrates that all MVP features were built Level 1, student did not achieve all of the MVP features of the project. And I'll mention level 3. I know some of you have worked on additional features that did not quite meet MVP. And so if you'd like to continue to work on that next week, you're welcome to do that, and that will also be part of your submission. And then team contribution, level 2, student was collaborative, able to work in a team environment and communicated changes to the team. And then level 1, student worked in silo and made little to no team contributions. So remember here that communication is key. So if you are making changes to the project that the developers are working on, let them know, and just make sure that you're all working together well and communicating. Questions on teamwork assessment?
Do we grade each other in the team?
I believe in Build Week there will be some sort of Airtable form where you'll get to provide a rating, and I believe there's also additional comments that you can add in.
Okay.
All right. Other questions on your mind related to Build Week, the assessment, the day over day, your project, your presentations?
Did you cover at all like what their turn-in submission looks like?
I missed that, Ash. Sorry, what did you say?
I said, did you cover like what their turn-in submission looks like? I wasn't sure if like you guys covered that at all, if you were talking about that.
Oh.
I know you guys were kind of doing like an overhead of like what day by day, and so I didn't know if you said anything about like how you turn in your actual work or whatnot, or what's expected.
Yeah, that's a good point. So in terms of deliverables, first, definitely link to your presentation that meets everything, at least level 2 or 3. And then as far as everything else that you see here, let me think about this. You can use your Figma link. Oh.
So the way I did it was I opened up a Google Doc and I put all the links to everything, like all my deliverables that were on the rubric. So it would be like high fidelity markups, a link to the folder that has them, or Figma link, or Trello link, or whatever. Everything that it asked for, I put it all in that one document. That's how I took mine in. Even the presentation link, I threw it in there.
Yeah.
But I didn't know if there was like, if it was said of like how they turn in their deliverables.
There's no set way. I like what you did with yours, Ash, because I want to make sure that if I'm looking at your Figma file, I'm looking at the right things. So it may be best, maybe we can create a template that you can all use, and then that way you can just add in your links and you can use that as part of your sprint retro submission, rather than for myself and Elizabeth to go into your file and just maybe not have a clue as to what we should be looking at. All right.
Will we be having a daily submission?
Ash, did you have daily submissions for Build Week?
Yeah. We had like a nightly summary. We had like stand-up meetings with our team every day, or like our normal TL groups too. So at the end of the day, we had TL meetings, and then we had to submit like a nightly. Well, mine's at night, so nightly summary, but daily summary of like what we did. Just kind of like give a small little summary.
Cool, thank you.
We need some sort of submission on a daily basis for the daily stand-up forum. Need that to do like the one-on-ones, like just like paperwork wise, like there has to be a submission for us to review.
Awesome, thank you, Kyla. Great. All right, other questions?
I had a question about us making iterations. So say we are comfortable with submitting what we have to the developers and they're working on it, and slowly I'm also making iterations and stuff like that. Do you want me to deliver that to them, or should I only focus on things that they come back to me and they're like, hey, we really can't do this, let's think of something else? So then I go through that process with them, and then they'll work on what they can do. Is it okay if I'm just working on other stuff and not necessarily give it to them, just to make sure that everybody can hit their MVPs?
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, so basically you would have two versions. You would have the original version that you were working back with them on, so you'll maintain that, but then you may have a second version just to, for example, let's say you change your color palette and that is what you want to submit as part of your sprint retro. That's fine. Just don't confuse them with the two. Don't let them,
right.
Yeah,
right.
Just make sure they're working off of the right file.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Other questions? Okay. All right. I know that was a lot of information. So instead of making you all stay on for longer, I will let you go a little bit earlier so that you can take an earlier lunch break. If there are questions that pop in, just ask them in the channel. Myself or TL will get back to you. And then we'll have more time tomorrow to talk about it. I'm happy that we got a chance today, so that way you get a preview as to what that looks like. So yeah, come prepared with questions. We can talk more about it tomorrow. And thanks for sticking with me. It was a lot. And enjoy your lunch. I'll see you all tomorrow. Thanks, everyone.